In June of 2001, the Reverend Chris Sterry, an Anglican priest from Lancashire, England, preached the longest sermon ever recorded. It lasted 37 hours, a Guinness World Record. He was not allowed to repeat himself, talk nonsense, or pause for more than 10 seconds. He started preaching on a Friday morning at 6:30 and finished up on Saturday evening at 7:30. He made an announcement leading up to his sermon that his text would be, quote, the Old Testament. He also said that hecklers would be welcome to help him stay awake, and that the sermon may or may not be a little boring at times. So this morning I figured, why not? Let's go for it. Let's go for 38 hours this morning. Let's go right now. Just kidding. No, I don't think there's enough coffee in the world to make me want to do something like that. But instead, in this 15-minute sermon this morning, we are going to be concluding our sermon series called Strange Things in the Bible. Over this series, we've been looking at some of the weird, odd, and strange things that we see in the Scriptures. And this morning, we're going to be talking about a man who falls asleep during the Apostle Paul's long-winded sermon. Our scripture this morning comes from Acts chapter 20, verses 7 through 12. On the first day of the week, as we gathered together for a meal, Paul was holding a discussion with them. Since he was leaving the next day, he continued talking until midnight. There were many lamps in the upstairs room where we had gathered. A young man named Eutychus was sitting in the window. He was sinking into a deep sleep as Paul talked on and on. When he was sound asleep, he fell from the third floor and died. Paul went down, fell on him, and embraced him, then said, "Don't be alarmed, he's alive." Then Paul went back upstairs and ate. He talked for a long time, right up until daybreak. Then he left. They took the young man away alive, and they were greatly comforted. Paul was supposed to leave the city of Troas the night before, but he started talking with some people who had gathered around him to learn from him, and this conversation eventually morphed into a full-fledged sermon as more and more people gathered into the room to hear Paul. And so as Paul preached on and on, it got darker and darker and later. Candles and lamps were lit to light up this dark room as the sermon continued on late into the night. The room must have been crowded. I can imagine there were people on the floor, some standing, some sitting, and we know that at least one person, a man named Eutychus, was sitting on a window sill. And while listening to Paul's sermon, Eutychus nods off and he sinks into a deep sleep. He falls out this window and tumbles to the ground 3 stories below to his death. Ironically, the name Eutychus is a name which means lucky. He doesn't seem very lucky to me, though. Now we can contribute this accident to it just being a late hour, and it's late, he was tired. But my hunch is that as the night went on, not only did it get late, but Paul's sermon got boring. There are 2 cardinal sins that preachers are in danger of committing every time that we preach. The first one is committing heresy or preaching bad theology. And the second one is being boring. And there's some debate on which cardinal sin is worse. I think I know which one Eutychus would vote for, though. And I know that no one here in this church can relate to this story at all. No one in this church has ever been bored, right? Okay, I'm the first to admit that sometimes we preachers can go on and on a little bit too long from time to time. Sometimes we don't know when to land the plane and we just keep circling the runway. Sometimes church can be boring. And in our text this morning, we have the first recorded incident in the history of the Christian church in which a young person is literally bored to death by preaching. But perhaps the strangest part of this story isn't so much that Eutychus falls out the window, but it's that nobody notices that he's about to fall out the window. Nobody sees him there teetering on the windowsill asleep and thinking, hey, maybe you should get down from there. In this crowded room full of people, nobody notices what's going on. Either everyone is completely enthralled in every word that Paul is saying and they literally can't take their eyes off of him because he's so riveting, or they too are nodding off and falling asleep. Notice that nobody sees Eutychus teetering on this windowsill, and I think it's probably because they're checked out mentally. They're just hoping that Paul would just shut up. When Eutychus fell out the window, the people on the street rushed to him because they thought he was dead. And I imagine they cried and they screamed, and the scriptures even said that they picked up his body. Here we see this scene of death and tragedy. At first, it's kind of a humorous story about a guy falling asleep during a sermon, but it turns into a tragedy when he falls to his death. A once vibrant and young disciple of Jesus is now dead. Then Paul is brought down to this tragic scene, and Paul embraces him, and he announces, wait a minute, he's not dead, he's alive, 'tis but a scratch. And now some scholars might argue that Eutychus never actually died. Paul simply went down and stated the situation just as it was. It's okay, he survived the fall, he's alive. It was just a near-death experience. But I don't know. I'm not so sure that was the case. I don't think Eutychus survived that fall. I think the people on the street saw a man who had lost his life. I think the finality of death was staggering in that moment. And I think that this is really a story of moving from death into new life. But no matter how you look at it, whether you think he survived that fall or not, I would claim that either way, this is a resurrection story. This is a story of a man who was revived, who had a second chance at life, who was filled with the breath of God in a way that perhaps he had never experienced before. Eutychus was dead, but now he is alive. I love the stories of the resurrection stories that we have in our scriptures, and we can think of course, Jesus' resurrection, and we can think of when Jesus raised the widow of Nain, Jairus' daughter, and Lazarus, all from the dead as well. And then in the Old Testament, in 1 Kings 17, the prophet Elijah embraces the dead son of the widow of Zarephath and brings him back to life. Likewise, in 2 Kings chapter 4, the prophet Elisha embraces the Shunammite widow's son and revives him as well. In these dramatic Old Testament resurrection stories, we see this embrace that happens. Elijah embrace those that are being resurrected, resuscitated, and so too does Paul. Paul embraces Eutychus in this resurrection scene as well. It's interesting because there's even a story involving John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, who witnessed and experienced a resurrection encounter. In his journal, Wesley mentions a Mr. Mayrick who came down sick about the same time that Wesley himself did. And while Wesley recovered, Mr. Mayrick did not. His health continued to decline and he eventually died. But Wesley recounts his miraculous story, writing in his journal, "When I came home, they told me the physician said he did not expect Mr. Mayrick would live till the morning. I went to him, but his pulse was gone. He had been speechless and senseless for some time. A few of us immediately joined in prayer. I relate the naked fact. Before we had done, his sense and his speech returned. Now, he that will account for this by natural causes has my free leave. But I choose to say, this is the power of God." These are all amazing stories of people who are moving from death into new life. And you'd think for Paul that after all of this drama, it would be time to call it a day, to pack it in. However, once it's confirmed that Eutychus is okay, Paul goes right back to sharing the gospel. He carries on like nothing ever happened. He goes back upstairs, he breaks bread, he eats, and he continues to talk and talk and talk until daybreak. It's like, dude, no one to quit. And I guess, I don't know, there's just something about Paul something within him that just can't help it. He simply has to share the good news. He has to proclaim that this resurrection goes far beyond Eutychus. Because in Jesus' resurrection, we all get to share in that new life. As Jesus himself once said, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live even though they die." Today we celebrate All Saints' Day. This is a day when we remember and celebrate all the Christian people of every time and of every place. We celebrate this communion of saints in our universal church around the world, but also we celebrate the saints that we have known and loved right here in our local congregation as well. And I love what Frederick Buechner says about this holy day in the life of the church. He writes, "On All Saints' Day, it is not just the saints of the church that we should remember in our prayers, but all the foolish ones and wise ones and shy ones and overbearing ones, the broken ones, the whole ones, the despots, the tosspots, the crackpots of our lives who one way or another have been our particular fathers and mothers and saints, and whom we love without knowing we love them, and by whom we were helped to whatever little we may have or ever hope to have, some kind of seedy sainthood of our own." On this day, we celebrate all of those whom we have learned from, all of those whom we have loved, all of those whom we have shared our lives with. Remember all of those folks with all of their flaws and imperfections, with all of their strengths and blessings. We recognize the ways in which God has worked in those relationships, and we're thankful for the memories that we share with them as well. As Eutychus moved from death to new life, we celebrate the saints who have died and found new life in glory. But this is not the end of their story. In the Apostles' Creed, we state the core of our Christian beliefs. And in one of those statements, we say, "We believe in the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and the life everlasting." We miss our loved ones who have gone on to glory. We miss our friends and family who are no longer with us here on earth. But we can continue on in our lives. We can celebrate. We can live out our call as disciples, knowing that there is a resurrection to come, that we will be united again one day. So, my friends, it's time for us to wake up. We need to get to work, because the church has become, for many, a sleepy place, a place of death. Every year, more and more churches close and shut down. Churches are dying. People have stopped coming to church. They've stopped seeing the importance of belonging to a community of faith and believers. United Methodist scholar Lovett Williams Jr. claims that any church with a median age of over 60 is a church on the way out. It's time for us to wake up. Like Paul, we have to keep at it. We have to get back to work. We have to keep preaching the good news. We have to keep sharing the love of Christ. We have to keep inviting others to come and worship with us. We have to keep up our mission to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Sometimes we get stuck in a rut. Sometimes we fall asleep to the work that Jesus is calling us to do. Sometimes we need to wake up and see what God is doing in our midst. I have to imagine that the Apostle Paul was thinking about Eutychus when he wrote to the Ephesians, "Wake up, sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." Perhaps Paul is uttering those words to you and me this morning as well. Wake up, O sleeper, arise. Christ will shine on you. May it be so. Amen.